Coming up on this episode.
So this 8 hours doesn't really come from the research anyway. So if you're just looking at a duration metric, that's the first one that we should query. But yes, absolutely. I think those that feel that sleep can be and should be perfect every single night, interestingly, they're the ones that will often feel they're not sleeping as well, because they can't seem to get to that place that is perfection. And actually perfection in science very rarely exists. For example, the weekdays look very different to the weekend, and how you feel at the weekend, including those Sunday night blues, often actually have way more to do with how dysregulated your sleep-wake cycle is and a lot of your circadian rhythms. Because how many things do you do the same during the weekend as you do during the week in terms of like when you get up, how you eat, how you move your body? Obviously, a lot of us do it differently, but that's a problem. So really, this industrial revolution that happened really mucked us up a little bit. I love light alarms. I love them. They're so incredibly amazing compared to a noise alarm because it wakes you up gently, and light is really good for us. It makes you feel so good so quickly. But if you can't have that in the room because somebody else is going to be getting up later, then being able to leave the room quietly and going somewhere else and then exposing yourself to light, it's tricky. I'm not going to argue that it's easy or there's a really easy solution, but I think it's really important to know that we haven't evolved to sleep together.
Welcome to the People Performance Podcast. The People Performance Podcast is made up of 3 series. First up, we have the Leader Lounge episodes with founder of T2, Martin Johnson. Then we have the guest interview episodes. And finally, we have our performance episodes delivered by our very own T2 consultants. For now, sit back, tune in and enjoy the People Performance Podcast.
So welcome to the People Performance Podcast with me, Martin Johnson. And I'm delighted today because I've got a very special guest on the podcast, Stephanie Romiszewski. So let me just introduce you, Stephanie, and then we'll get stuck into it. Stephanie is a leading sleep physiologist, entrepreneur and media expert dedicated to transforming how we think about sleep. As the founder of Sleep Ahead Clinic and CMO of ReSleep, she blends cutting-edge science with real-world solutions, helping thousands worldwide break free from sleep obsession and try to achieve a balanced, healthy relationship when it comes to sleep and rest. With nearly 2 decades of experience in sleep research and clinical sleep disorders, Stephanie has treated over 10,000 individuals, from Premier League footballers to high-profile CEOs, shift workers and parents, and everything in between. Her approach is refreshingly practical, rejecting fear-driven narratives and empowering people with evidence-based, achievable sleep strategies that fit real life. Stephanie, welcome to the People Performance Podcast. Did I do you justice with that intro?
You did. It's always really weird listening to someone talk about you, but yes, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And for people out there as well, Stephanie will be joining us at the T2 Leadership Retreat in the summer. So I'm looking forward to engaging more with you there. But a chance today to spend 45 minutes with you and pick your brains on all things sleep. So my first question, Stephanie, is leading sleep physiologist and a new mum, a relatively new mum to a 9-month-old baby. So how's your sleep going right now?
Well, much better than it was at the beginning, let me tell you. My gosh. And I actually wrote my book, Think Less, Sleep More, whilst I was pregnant, which was really interesting because it suddenly gave me some humility that I needed probably. But no, I do sleep fairly well, but I think that's maybe because I don't worry at all about sleep.
Good answer. We're going to come to it. You are human like us all, Stephanie.
Yes.
So we know that the most sleep deprived time of your life could be just after having children. So, but you mentioned something there in your answer. You said, I tend to sleep pretty well anyway. And I would absolutely make that statement about myself. I seem to naturally and always have been okay with sleep and being able to sleep. And there's those people out there who have always maybe struggled to some extent or had not had the right relationship with sleep. So my first question is, do we win the lottery, the biochemistry lottery with sleep, or do we become incredibly unlucky just from our genetics that we inherit?
There's 2 sort of answers to this question. The first one is yes, there are a lot of genetics that will determine how you sleep, but the most important thing is asking you, well, what's your definition of a good sleeper? Because I think that is currently our problem with defining sleep and understanding whether we're sleeping well or not. For example, when you are a sleep physiologist like me and you're performing sleep polysomnography, which is like an overnight sleep study, is very, 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 very rare to see somebody have no awakenings in the night. They won't notice them, but we will see it in their sleep sort of architecture and all those sleep stages they go through, these mini awakenings, which they might not fully wake up. It might just be into a lighter stage of sleep, but that happens all the way through the night, and that's normal. So when people think they're having this consolidated block of sleep, it's actually unusual to find somebody who's having a complete block that way. And I would argue probably not normal.
That's a great answer. And so what you're saying there is, just to pick the main message out of that, is it is entirely normal scientifically to have different stages of sleep and not sleep solidly all night for that classic 8 hours of sleep. And so do you think, therefore, you also mentioned about overthinking and becoming anxious with sleep. Do you think that the false narrative makes us feel anxious about what could be normal sleep, but we're judging it against a criteria of, if I don't go to bed at 9 or 10 at night and sleep until 6 a.m, then I've not slept well? Do you think there's a little bit of re-education to be had around what sleep is and isn't?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, massively. I think even the 8-hour sort of idea just comes from some guy during the Industrial Revolution trying to figure out, well, how much of the day should we give to sleeping? How much of the day should we give to working? They just needed to split the day in a way that was helpful industrially. And so they did. So this 8 hours doesn't really come from the research anyway. So if you're just looking at a duration metric, that's the first one that we should query. But yes, absolutely. I think those that feel that sleep can be and should be perfect every single night, interestingly, they're the ones that will often feel they're not sleeping as well, because they can't seem to get to that place that is perfection. And actually, perfection in science very rarely exists.
So then, given what you've said there, Stephanie, circadian rhythm, will you talk to me about that? Because you mention it a lot when we've spoken in the past. It gets mentioned in sleep. What is a circadian rhythm, and what's important to understand it about sleep? And do we all have a slightly different circadian rhythm?
So circadian just means about a day in Latin. And what we're talking about is the sort of processes, the physiological processes that happen over a 24-hour period. So that would be a circadian rhythm, something that happens over a 24-hour period. Your sleep-wake cycle is one of them, one of the most important ones, one of the most obvious ones, because you have this time when you tend to sleep and this time where you tend to be awake. You have others, so your temperature regulation, your hormone regulation, your mood hormone regulation, your appetite regulation. There's quite a few of them. And what it means is that you essentially have a clock inside your brain that likes to run to time, obviously. So a bit like if you go to a train station and all the trains are, wanting to leave at a certain time, so do certain processes. And the problem is that there are loads of ways to influence those processes. And so if you do something that kind of gets you out of sync with that sort of clock, then you start to notice that you start performing less predictably. You start feeling maybe sleepy at times of the day you want to feel awake. You start feeling awake in the middle of the night, wired but tired, that kind of stuff. And so essentially your circadian rhythms are really, really important. We're just not really taught that in sleep. And so we believe that this metric of sleep duration is the most important thing. Predictability in your sleep behaviors is quite important, but predictability in how your sleep should actually look every single night, that's not real. It should be a little bit variable in order to help you manage your day, manage how much you've used your muscles, your inflammatory system, all those things, they're happening when you sleep. So that circadian rhythm is just there to keep your sleep-wake cycle to time. There are influences, like light exposure is probably the most influential thing on your circadian rhythms. And of course, since the Industrial Revolution, we're allowed to have light whenever the hell we want, and that is a problem now. There are other things that can impact it too, like moving your body and eating. Eating can tell your brain that actually it's time to be awake and digest, etc., and not a time to be sleeping. So if you're sort of thinking, whilst I'm talking, when do you do those things and how predictably do you do those things? Because if you find that you eat and you sort of wake up at all different times in the morning, for example, lying in, you eat at different times, you move your body at different times, you get your light at different times, is it any wonder then that our sort of sleep quality doesn't feel as good? Is it any wonder that you often feel fatigued during the day and possibly feeling very awake at night? That has got nothing to do with your sleep per se, as in that one small block of time. It's more to do with your circadian rhythms as a whole and the influence that you have over them.
So what I take from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, is what you're saying is it doesn't really matter that different people have different routines, but what matters is that you have some form of consistent routine. So if people are listening to this now, let's say I get up in the morning, I have my morning coffee, I go to work, I don't eat my first meal until lunch, I then have my lunch, I then work the afternoon, I will hit the gym after work religiously every day, then I go home and I have my evening meal around 6-7 p.m. and then I'll wind down and usually go to bed around 10 p.m. and I wake up at 7 in the morning. If I do that consistently every day with light exposure, eating at certain times, my circadian rhythm is going to start forming, if you like, as a result of the consistency. However, if the next person doesn't do anything like that, they go to the gym in the morning, they don't start work until midday, they work into the 8 or 9 at night, they don't go to bed until midnight, 1 in the morning, but they sleep solidly, then what you're saying is that if that works for that person and there's consistency, that can still constitute healthy sleep.
Yes, the unpredictability of your behaviors is what tends to cause the sort of unpredictability in how you feel. What I would say, though, is we do know that obviously if you get light when you first wake up in the morning, you're going to highly influence that time of the morning to be an alert time for you. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can influence whether you are a morning type or you're an evening type. So a lot of people who assume that that is genetic, and of course there is a genetic component to this, don't realize that perhaps it's, especially in sort of a high performing work culture, they don't sometimes realize that they've actually shifted everything themselves. And that's not a problem. If that's not a problem for you and you prefer that and it works for you, there is no problems with that at all. It's just that when it becomes very unpredictable and all over the place, like for example, the weekdays look very different to the weekend, and how you feel at the weekend, including those Sunday night blues, often actually have way more to do with how dysregulated your sleep-wake cycle is and a lot of your circadian rhythms. Because how many things do you do the same during the weekend as you do during the week in terms of like when you get up, how you eat, how you move your body? Obviously, a lot of us do it differently, but that's a problem. So really, this industrial revolution that happened really mucked us up a little bit. We're less of what we were evolved to be, and we haven't evolved quick enough to deal with that new technology and that new light exposure and all the things that come with it.
Okay, let me shift a little bit and talk to you about sleep anxiety and overthinking and then stressing. So given everything we've said on this podcast so far, the industrial revolution, the working day, the way we've set up and the narrative we've formed around sleep, it's causing sleep anxiety and overthinking in many people. I mean, I talk to a lot of people, Stephanie, you do. The one thing they always say is, I wish I could sleep better, or I wish I could be a good sleeper, or whatever it might be. What is sleep anxiety in a sense, and how does that actually affect the sleep, and what do we do to try and be less anxious about sleep?
There's
like 4 questions in there.
I'll start with the definition. So just like any anxiety, it's where you become sort of preoccupied with thinking a lot about one particular thing. And in this situation, it's sleep. And that could be before you go to bed, you start getting worried about the bedtime routine and whether you're going to sleep or not. Perhaps it's in the middle of the night when you find yourself awake and you're now looking at the clock and thinking about how many hours you've got to the morning and what might go wrong. Because again, you've been taught that, the amount you're getting is the most important thing, and you will not be able to function if you don't. Well, a lot of people, especially listening to your podcast, will actually know that they can probably cope with a lot more than they realize. Or it could be, during the day when you start cancelling really important activities like moving your body, like socialization, like so many other things, because now you're so preoccupied with making sure that your sleep's okay that you're willing to shift your entire life. And that's what I see in clinic a lot. So people who have cancelled seeing their friends in the later evening because they're so worried it's going to impact their sleep, which might seem like a good thing, but actually every now and again socialization should take priority because we're social creatures and we need to see our friends and family. Things like moving our bodies. Some people feel like conserving energy, not going out because they don't feel like it, because they feel too fatigued and they believe that fatigue is due to not sleeping well. They won't perform as well, or they'll be dangerous. So then they don't move their bodies and it's got out of hand. Now, the issue with in the moment getting sleep anxious, so starting to really start worrying about your sleep in the moment, let's say it's just before you go to bed. So I like to refer to sleep anxiety as the sleep anxiety gremlins. And there are two things in the moment that they are sort of weaponized with. So if we think about just before we go to bed, there are two things that can happen. The first one is if you're starting to get sleep anxious, so you're starting to like a bit of a cloud going over you, you're starting to have all these sort of horrible, insidious thoughts about, what if I don't sleep now? It's going to be another awful night. What's going to happen tomorrow? And then it snowballs. It's not just thinking, is it? You're tending to increase your heart rate, your temperature, your cortisol levels are going to start going up, and you're not going to have all this lovely sleepy hormone. So melatonin is going to drift right away. You're not going to have that physiological wind down for sleep. So you have the ability, or that sleep anxiety gremlin can push your sleep away in the moment. So that's the first weapon that it has. The second weapon that they tend to have is that if you start worrying about things, you tend to want to find a solution. You tend to want to start doing something to try and fix it. And that's a real issue with anxiety, because what you tend to do is you tend to listen to a lot of biases that you might have around sleep. I know that sleep, for example, sleep duration is the most important thing. So if that's the case, then I should spend more time in bed. So now you're not even sleepy and you're sleep anxious, but you take yourself to your dark room early and you void yourself of all stimulus, and you wonder why the panic goes up rather than down and the sleepiness goes away rather than overcoming you. Because this idea that you should just be able to go to the bedroom and sleep is ridiculous, really. It doesn't make any sense. So they're really good, those anxiety gremlins, at warping how you see what you should be doing and really terrifying you into action, often the wrong actions. And then those get reinforced over time. So now there's like a third weapon, if you want, which is where over time, because your brain is so clever, it can actually learn the new pattern, assuming that you want it. Because if you do something over and over enough, your brain, being very adaptive, will just learn it and just think, oh, this is the new sleep program. She wants to be nice and awake at 3 a.m. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start making her hungry, and I'm going to start making her think about all the things that she didn't do well today and blah, blah, blah. And so you're sort of sat up thinking, why the hell is this happening to me? But your brain's going, oh, I thought you wanted this. This is me trying to help you. So it's quite insidious sleep anxiety, but it doesn't need to be something that's there. And I think that's probably why I recently wrote Think Less, Sleep More. Because when I was 19, I had this incredible opportunity to go to Harvard Medical School and do sleep research. And I learned very quickly at a very young age about circadian rhythms and what's really important, what really influences your sleep, what doesn't. And it's like a biological process that's really natural and it's never going to go away. And I learned that from a really early age. And so I never worried about sleep. But what I realized is the whole world around me was really worried about sleep.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you made there. And so I guess just picking out some practical reflections for people listening to this. The first thing we talked about in circadian rhythm was it doesn't matter what your routine is, but have some form of consistent routine to your day. to your eating patterns, to your light exposure patterns, to your workouts, to try to have something so your body and brain say, this is what we do, and then this is when I know it's time to shut down and start to sleep. If we're too inconsistent with that, we don't really know. The circadian rhythm becomes disjointed and all over the shop, and we don't really get that consistency. I think that's the first thing that I picked out of it. The second thing you said there is just know that the more you worry and try to force and control sleep, the worse it's going to be for you, right? And so don't be forcing things and taking yourself off to bed if you're not tired and, trying different things. It's almost like reducing the anxiety, and the way you think about sleep is already going to help you get better sleep and more sleep. Okay, so the question I've got next is, a lot of people ask, and they'll probably ask you too, about the difference in the sleep stages. So light sleep versus REM versus deep sleep. I think you once told me there's 5 stages of sleep. Have I remembered that correctly? Or
3. About 3.
3.
There's about 3.
So is everybody weirdly and wonderfully different when it comes to the time periods they spend in sleep, i.e. light, REM and deep? And a couple of the guys downstairs, when I said I was going to speak to you, asked me to ask this question. Everybody wears a smartwatch now, and we all get up in the morning and the watch says to us, 8 hours restorative sleep, or 6 hours non-restorative, or plenty of REM, or deep periods of sleep, right? It gives us this data. How reliable is that data? And going back to it, are we all different when it comes to sleep stages?
So, okay. Again, you might have to re-ask me some of these questions, but the first one, let's go through the stages so you understand what is actually going on. So when you fall asleep, you don't just go from light to deep, though that does kind of happen a little bit. It's just that it's a bit more complicated. So you go from stage 1 and 2, which is a bit like shutting your eyes and still being awake, to then being in a very light sleep. Now, interestingly, you spend most of your time, and I think this is where people get really confused, you spend most of your sleep time in stage 2 sleep, which is that light sleep. That's where we are most of the time, okay? You then go in a sort of a usual pattern into deep sleep or stage 3 or slow wave sleep. All these things mean the same thing, which is deep sleep. Now, in a very rudimentary sense, this area of your sleep, we seem to know that, or at least we know so far, that stage is much more for your physical restoration. So think of your cell restoration, muscle tissue, inflammatory response, growth hormones. That's where all that juicy stuff is happening. And then you go into something called REM. Now, REM is a bit confusing because, first of all, it's not a deep stage of sleep. It's actually quite a light stage of sleep. It would be easy to rouse someone from REM. And there is even theory out there that it's not even a stage of sleep, it's another sort of state of consciousness. That's how wild it is and how little we sort of still don't know. But REM is often where you have your most graphic dreams, though you can dream in other areas of your sleep. And it's more for your sort of memory consolidation and emotional resilience and things like that. So it's more sort of psychological if you were to look at it in a really basic way. Now, how much time do you spend in those areas? About 20 to 25%. And that will change. And so will the rest of the stages in order to always reach that 100%. That will change depending on what your day has been like. Has it been very emotional? Has it been 3 hours at the gym, which is highly unusual for you, or a marathon, highly unusual for you? So you're going to notice that your sleep will be different. The stages of sleep aren't very accurate on a sleep tracker because they can't really tell what stage you're in. You couldn't do that unless you had brain activity. And to get brain activity, you need electrodes super glued to your head.
So on this then, Stephanie, would it be safe to say, and I know I'm pushing you into something that you say, but would it be safe to say then that sleep trackers, watches, headbands, the things that are giving you data based on very limited scientific testing, probably heart rate and body temperature and stuff like that, would it be safe to say that are they close to being indicatively true, or is it take it with a pinch of salt, or is it completely disregard it,
Do you know what? It's a difficult question to ask or answer, because I'm not against sleep tracking. And the reason being is that anything that can give you some sort of baseline. So as long as it's not wobbly and variable all the time, it's still giving you some sort of baseline. I think it could be quite useful depending on what your goal is. Okay. Sleep tracking for tracking's sake is absolute nonsense. I don't do it. I'd never do it. That doesn't make any sense to me. However, if you wanted to do it for a particular reason, and this is very important, you didn't really think about the numbers, because often we have this preoccupation as humans with numbers and what they might mean. And we really do emphasize the importance of a high number over a low number, for example. Like, that psychology is really interesting all by itself, let alone when you start looking at like the metrics of sleep and whether duration is as important as we thought it was. So yeah, it's tricky, because I would say that it's the UX experience right now. So the data output that the individual is getting is where we have gone completely wrong. I do not understand, and I never will, why just throwing a shit ton of data at an individual is supposed to be useful. I just don't understand. And then, unfortunately, I would say that some of these tracking sort of developers, they've started to realize this. But now what they're doing is they're using things like terminology like sleep debt, sleep banking, sleep duration, and using and extrapolating their data to tell you something about those particular things without defining them properly, or at least the way I see the definitions, not very scientifically. And that is causing a problem with people who are more predisposed to getting a bit anxious over tracking technology. Just to put it out there, I used to track my runs quite a lot, and I had to stop tracking them because I started to realize that I started with the goal of wanting to get faster, wanting to get more efficient, all of that. And then actually it really started to do a number on me. For example, I would forget my tracker a few times, and then it was like I hadn't even done the run. And I was like, wow, that's scary. And that's kind of what's happening with sleep data now. And we've got lots of research to show how if we manipulate that tracker to show that you had a bad night, even when you had a good night, your physiological outcomes the next day are very similar to you having a bad night. So that's quite worrying, that it's the tracker itself that's able to really dictate how you feel physiologically and psychologically. That's really, really worrying. So it's not sleep tracking in general that I have a problem with. I mean, we track movement data in our clinics when we have someone who might have a circadian issue, because we want to try and help them. So we need to look at their movement over time to try to kind of track where they possibly are the most still, to see if hopefully that is sleep over time. It's very expensive to look at brain activity every night for a few weeks. Like, it's at least a couple of thousand for a study, if not way more. That was years ago. So yeah, it's a complicated answer.
No, it's interesting what you say, because as I say, as someone who has I would say, a positive relationship with my sleep, I'm in the sense of what I mean by that is I feel relatively happy with the sleep I get. I feel relatively relaxed.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to irritate people when I say that, because they'll be sitting there going, how, I would pay millions for that. But I genuinely do. But what psychologically it does do to me when I look at my watch in the morning, and let's say it's the weekend and I've had a bottle of wine on the night and I've slept 8 hours and my watch says non-restorative. And I think, what? How can that be? I'll decide if it was restorative, thank you very much. It's in your mind that actually I've slept poorly, I'm going to be tired, I'm going to struggle today, So I know what you say about the data can really start, you become obsessed by the narrative the data is feeding you, and it may or may not be the truth. Right, I want to shift, because I want to ask you a couple more things. And a couple of people asked me to ask a couple of the questions that they wanted me to ask as well. So, of course, what we're establishing here is routine and consistency in your circadian rhythm matters. Reducing sleep anxiety matters. And understand that good sleep or a good relationship is different things to different people in terms of the duration and in terms of the time frames, which is hopefully refreshing for people to hear and just start reflecting on. Okay, so what happens in a couple of things where, for example, let me talk about menopause. So in the menopause for women, does that affect the sleep?
Yeah.
And if so, what do they need to think about, or what can they do to support their relationship with sleep when it's a tough period in menopause?
So I think most important thing, especially when we talk about expectations around sleep, which I think is the biggest thing that most of us need to change, is that you are not going to sleep the same as when you were 20 as when you are 45, no matter whether you're going through menopause or not. Okay. That's really important. Every single life change you go through is going to have an impact on your sleep. Is it going to be a long-term one? Possibly not, but that your sleep is going to change. Does that mean it's suddenly gone from really, really good to really, really bad? No, not necessarily. It's just that we don't understand change. And so we think it's bad every single time. It might be that your baseline shifts and what your sleep looks like, what's the definition of good sleep for you, is likely to change, right? This is really important. I'm not trying to belittle what happens during menopause, but this is important for us all to understand, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we're going through. With menopause specifically, you are absolutely going to go through various shifts which are going to 100% have some kind of impact on your sleep. That is because of all the different symptoms that you're going to go through. First of all, the hormonal shifts have various effects on your sleep. So progesterone and estrogen will both have different effects on sleep. You will then have other symptoms like, for example, temperature regulation issues, so night sweats and things like that, which are going to wake you up from your sleep. You're then going to start to notice psychologically that you might start to feel different. So you might start to find you're more anxious, or you have different types of mood that are not predictable in the same way as they were before. This list is endless, by the way. So we could be here for a long time talking about all the different impacts of sleep. What we do know now in the research is that if you improve your sleep, you can improve how well you go through the menopause, which is incredible, right? The problem is that people are being told you got to do all this stuff. And a lot of people hear the sleep hygiene list. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but sleep hygiene, how to get a good night's sleep. If you Google how to get a good night's sleep, it will come up with this endless list of things. And in every single organization, they have their list of sleep hygiene. They're kind of similar, like things like temperature, make sure your temperature's right, make sure you have a hot warm bath before you go to bed, don't drink too much caffeine, go to bed at the same time. Now there's a problem with a lot of that sleep hygiene, and that is that whilst almost everything on that sleep hygiene list will be fine, you will find some kind of way that it does have an impact on sleep. Does that mean when sleep gets poor because of things like the menopause, you changing the temperature in your room before you go to bed is going to make a massive shift? Not really. There are a few key things when it comes to your sleep baseline and strengthening it, and strengthening what I like to call your sleep muscle, that you can do, and they are very similar to what we talked about. So for example, getting up at the same time, that is more important than when you go to bed. You'll notice your bedtime becomes more predictable because of your get up time. But if you're busy trying to go to bed early or going to bed at the same time, but you don't look after your get up time, you're doing it the wrong way around, because getting up in the morning.
Sorry, Stephanie, just let me repeat that, because I feel like it's a salient point. It's made me think. So you're saying, for people listening to this, that your get up time in the morning, and when you say get up, you don't mean just awake, you mean physically get up and be active and get on with your day. If you keep that really consistent, despite the variation in sometimes the going to bed, that is really important for your overall sleep patterns.
Yes, so we talked about your circadian rhythm, but we didn't talk about the other very important mechanism in your sleep, which is your sleep drive, your homeostatic sleep drive. Now, all that means is that in order to sleep, you need to build up a drive to do it, right? And in order to be awake, you need to build up a drive to do that too. And guess what? In order to sleep, you need to spend time being awake. In order to be awake, you need to spend time being asleep. This is really, really important. And if you think about the predictability of things, that circadian rhythm again, and your body wanting to do things at a certain time, if you get up at the same time every day, so you provide your body with an anchor point, right, then what's going to happen is you're going to predictably build a sleep drive that probably makes you sleepy around about the same time every night. Not always, because there are too many variables in your life and things that are going to happen to you across it, especially in females because of the hormonal changes that are going to impact that process. But if you were to be more consistent with that most important influential rule, which is try to get yourself up and going at the same time every day, you will notice that everything else becomes much more predictable. So that, I mean, if you asked me, for example, what is the one thing that everybody could do in the whole world to sleep better, that would be the only thing I'd really say is, do you know what? Stop worrying about it. Just don't think about your sleep ever, but get up at the same time as much as you can. You can't be perfect. You're not a robot. Sometimes you're going to lie in, but if you're consistently doing it to try to cope, it is the very art of or act of you lying in that's probably making this whole thing worse. And then eating your meals, trying to be as consistent as you can. There's no, I'm not going to dictate that you have to have breakfast, you have to do this, you have to do that. The most important thing for me is your consistency, because I know that strengthens your sleep baseline. And that if you then go into the menopause, or you're indeed suffering from it right now, you're probably going to feel a lot better. You're going to strengthen your resilience against all those variables that are going to start attacking your sleep. And you're probably going to deal with them a hell of a lot better. That's what it gives you to strengthen your sleep baseline. It's basically like a superpower.
Love that. I'm going to take that with myself. I mean, I think about it, and I said about my relationship with sleep. I do get up at the same time every day, even on weekends, because of the things that I'm involved in, and it just sort of makes perfect sense. I'm not going to go into debunking the myths about sleep aids and stuff. We're going to save that for the retreat, right? But what I did want to ask you is, I asked you the menopause question.
Yeah.
There will be some people listening to this who either themselves or their children have got neurodiverse conditions like ADHD and autism. My son has himself, and he's always on and always up at the crack of dawn. And what you would typically say, and this is interesting because you're making me rethink about it already. I would have said, I don't think my son gets quality sleep. You might go, well, who are you to say that? That might be normal for him, right? I know you're going to say it to me, but how does that affect sleep in people with ADHD and autism and other neurodiverse conditions?
So this is an incredibly important topic, and it is again about expectations and variation across individual differences. Okay. Now, first of all, I'm not a specialist in neurodivergence. This is really important. However, what I can tell you is that, especially in things like autism, ADHD, things like that, we do tend to see that the circadian phase is slightly different. It's more like a night owl's circadian phase. So instead of winding down before bedtime, it feels like a bit of a wind up. And so what you might notice is that actually when those people feel sleepy and awake are very different to actually someone who's a bit more neurotypical, whatever that means now. So actually, do we need to look at those things differently? Do we need to try to think of different ways to support those people? 100%. And there's not that much data or information out there yet about this. I do tend to see people with ADHD and autism in clinic, and we do adapt our sleep retraining for them, because the reality is, are you going to get them to fit a model that is the same as somebody who does not think or feel or physiologically reflect how they are? No, why would we do that? But that's another problem that we really need to look at. So yeah, I would say that we need to stop looking at those people and thinking, oh, well, you're just being lazy, or you're not doing the right things at a certain time, or that's absolute nonsense. If you had that feeling of actually feeling really awake and energetic just before you go to bed, why the hell would you want to then lie down in a dark room? It doesn't make any sense.
I'm smiling because, it makes perfect sense. My son is very similar. He seems to be at the most energy at 5 o'clock in the morning. And as soon as his eyes are open, there's no way I'm going back to sleep. So I want my telly on, I'm up, I'm ready, and he does. And I guess sometimes it's difficult because we live in a world, like you said earlier, this 9 till 5 world where he has to go to school at 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. So you can't play around much with that sleep pattern because you've got to get it in a time frame,
That's, again, another really annoying topic for children is actually the way that their schooling and education is designed. I mean, it's in my nature to say that even in people who struggle with these kind of conditions, it is important to be consistent in no matter what you're trying to achieve. Consistency is key. But actually, who am I to say that? Because the reality is, actually, we might find research in the future that shows that actually not being consistent and allowing it to play out in the way that it is, and just being a little bit more adaptable in everyday life. Our world as we know it right now is designed for a very specific person. If you fall outside of that, then, you're the problem. And actually, that's utterly ridiculous. But that's kind of the world we live in right now. So I want to say consistency is still key. And I have seen good results when trying to train people up to sleep again. But I think it's important to reflect that if you don't have to have consistency, for example, if you don't have to be at school at a certain time and you don't have to do this, that, or the other, well, maybe that's the issue right there. I don't know. Anyway, it's a bigger conversation to have.
But what we're saying there is definitely science and evidence suggests that in neurodiverse brains, their circadian rhythms are slightly different, if not complete opposite, where they start to all come alive with energy towards the end of the day into an evening. And so the sleep pattern of the way of life that we've created is a challenge for them.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, get it. Final question, Stephanie, because I'm going to save everything else and keep our powder dry for the retreat. Again, there's people listening to this who have partners who affect their sleep, right? So it's not just about you in a dark room and your own circadian rhythm. If you have a partner who snores, if you have a partner who fidgets, who works shifts, who's coming in banging, clattering, who has to sleep with white noise on or lights or whatever it might be, is there a case to say that we can affect each other's sleep? And we have this modern day thing in marriages, don't we, where it's perfectly okay to sleep in separate rooms if it maintains the harmony and allows us to have our own circadian rhythms and sleep. Do you get a lot of people coming to you with this question around, my partner's affecting my sleep?
Oh my God, yeah, completely. And often I think to myself, do you know what? If I had a complete night owl as a partner, I'm not sure if I would be able to cope because I'm complete opposite. You've got two options here. And the research, when you look at relationships and sleeping in separate bedrooms, is quite biased. Now they're starting to realize that actually maybe we need to have a look at it again. But essentially, if it works for you, leaving the bedroom is actually really important, and having another place to sleep. If you have that privilege and you can sleep somewhere else, sleep with somebody else. I mean, you could sleep with somebody else, but that might not be helpful for other reasons. But the reality is, if you can find some sort of compromise, and this is the tricky part, a lot of people would have to do this, meeting somewhere in the middle where you have some kind of get up time that works for both of you, or you have a system where the first person gets up, but I love light alarms. I love them. They're so incredibly amazing compared to a noise alarm because it wakes you up gently, and light is really good for us. It makes you feel so good so quickly. But if you can't have that in the room because somebody else is going to be getting up later, then being able to leave the room quietly and going somewhere else and then exposing yourself to light, it's tricky. I'm not going to argue that it's easy or there's a really easy solution, but I think it's really important to know that we aren't designed, I don't like using that word, we haven't evolved to sleep together.
But we talk about evolution a lot, and that how we've never evolved to do certain things, but we've somehow created certain rules and ways and situations that were never there for our ancestors. And I guess sleeping is the same. Just quick one to finish on light alarms. So you said I like light alarms because they're a bit less invasive than that immediate alarm, and they gradually get lighter. And I'm guessing there's a little bit of subtle noise with them as well. Is that not manufactured light though, or does that constitute natural light?
So it is true that natural light tends to be the best for us, probably because, well, not probably, but there are lots of other benefits of having natural light, like, for example, vitamin D, and the fact that it's in your sort of peripheral vision everywhere. If you go outside, it's a lot brighter than you think because you've got light everywhere. It's coming at you from everywhere. But when you're in a room with light, it's, unless you've got a super bright light, you're probably not going to be able to reflect daylight quite the same. However, in the absence of light in the way that we absolutely would love it, it's absolutely fine to have artificial light. In fact, if it wasn't so influential, then it wouldn't be influencing us to stay up a little longer sometimes when you have it too late at night. So artificial light is the next best thing. And I would just say use whatever light you can get. Most people don't realize that they're probably not getting enough light. I would say that about most people. And one thing that really worried me once, I went on a Navy boat to do a talk for the Navy, and I took a little light meter around with me to see what kind of conditions they're working in. And this probably, you would see this in loads of industries, but in the middle of the night, the light in some areas is just ridiculous. And then the light in other areas in the middle of the day is also ridiculous, but on the other end of the scale. And it's just ridiculous. It's just crazy that we're not sort of working with what we already have. I mean, the Industrial Revolution helped us. We can have light now. So let's try to adapt it in a way that would suit us, or at least start that with our houses. Lighting architecture is a thing, and it's incredible. And we should really be designing our homes much better in terms of when we need light and when we need it to be darker and what type of light. I mean, it's a whole other conversation.
Honestly, I'm smiling because I used to serve in the Royal Navy, and I served on Type 42 destroyer ships, and I understand exactly what you're describing with the contrast of it's something being incredibly dark, like the operations room or on an evening, to these really bright lit areas in the middle of the night if you're on watch, and it is, and all of the time as well, no natural sunlight unless you go above deck. So it is a really, really harsh environment at times to be in. Stephanie, I could talk to you all day long, but let me just wrap up by just a couple of takeaways that I think out of this podcast I want the listeners to take. I think what I've sort of reflected on over this last 45, 50 minutes is the data still suggests that consistency is a positive thing. Having consistent routines is going to be better than having chaotic change too much and too often, because your circadian rhythm, through eating, digesting, through working out, through getting up in the morning, it can start to predict when the body and brain needs to sleep. So consistency is important. You said if you was going to say one thing to people, it's be consistent with your get up time, not so much your going to bed time, but if we make and form a habit of getting up in the morning, that can really start to get us going with our sleep. And I think the other thing I took away from it was, don't stress yourself. I know it's a simple thing to say to people when you say, don't want to, if it was easy, I wouldn't stress myself. But just know that the things we've talked about today is we've created this artificial world that we live in, and we've created these rules and time frames of what good sleep is. And that's actually causing people to be more anxious about not getting it, which is effectively in turn affecting the sleep. So just change your opinion on that. Be a bit more relaxed about it. It's not the case, and sleep means different things to different people. So I think there's a couple of things in there for me. If there was anything last takeaway from you, Stephanie, that you want the listeners to say, if you just say, look, there's one last thing, or there's something that I would reiterate, what in terms of trying their relationship with sleep, what would that be?
It might seem obvious, but you cannot lose the ability to sleep. Now, I know there are some people who've been through very extreme conditions, but that is not the average person. And even in those cases, you cannot just lose the ability to sleep. So I know sometimes it's not going to meet your expectations. I know that sometimes you might have a chronic condition or a psychiatric condition or something going on that is going to significantly impact the way you sleep. But your body is incredibly resilient at making whatever the new situation is work for it, and finding a way to give you these snippets of stage, deep stage of sleep, stage 3, or REM sleep when you need it. And it might not look like it did before, but I think the fear of that is actually reinforcing it way more than going through these particular changes that might actually would have only impacted you for a short while. So the biggest thing, the takeaway is you are never going to lose the ability to sleep, because I think that is at the end of a lot of people's fear when they're up at night. If you just let go of that and think, my body will allow me to sleep when it needs to. And I promise you that after doing this for 20 years and seeing all sorts of people with all sorts of sleep disorders, that is something that will happen for you eventually. And that's important to know.
I love that. It's quite liberating that your body will allow you to sleep when it needs to. Just drop the shoulders and relax. Stop stressing about it. And I liked what you said earlier as well. When you're in your 40s and you're approaching your 50s, you ain't not going to sleep like you did when you was a teenager or 20s. That happens to all human beings. We sleep generally less as we get older, right? Maybe that's an evolution of what your body needs at that point, but don't judge it on what you used to do, especially for women going through the menopause as well. Stephanie Romiszewski, I find it fascinating speaking to you. I always do. Thank you for your time. If you want to hear more from Stephanie, you can join us at the T2 Leadership Retreat. Stephanie is going to be one of our key speakers on one of the evenings. It's the 7th to the 9th of July, 2026, where you're going to get to engage with the audience. We're going to ask people their questions about relationship with sleep up front. We're going to get all the sleep aids and the things that we think are good for sleep on the stage, and you're going to talk us through whether those things actually work or not. So please do, if you're a leader out there or if you're somebody who is interested in that, come and join us at the retreat or inquire about that, and you can come and meet Stephanie in person. All that's left for me to say, Stephanie, is thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person in July.
Yes, thank you so much. I can't wait. It's going to be fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, and we'll be back shortly with another People Performance podcast.
The People Performance Podcast, brought to you by T2.